Passive House, I liken it to like finding a religion, right? I'm not a religious person, but it kind of, it gives you direction and it gives you meaning. You've got the science to back it up. You've got the modeling in pre-construction before it goes to site, and then you then test it along the way.
Welcome to the Passive House podcast, brought to you by Passive House Accelerator, a catalyst for zero carbon building. For news, inspiration, and connections from all flavours of Passive House, check out passivehouseaccelerator.com. Sign up to receive regular updates about events, get your questions answered, and contribute to the community dialogue. There's loads of free information for experienced professionals and people just starting out on their Passive House journey. We hope to see you at one of our weekly Passive House Accelerator live webinars. You can also check out our Reimagined Buildings YouTube channel for some great inspiration for both building new or renovating. In the meantime, here's this week's Passive House podcast. Welcome back to the Passive House podcast. I'm Matthew Cutler-Welsh, coming to you from Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland in New Zealand.
And I'm Zach Semke, coming to you from Seattle, Washington.
How you going, Zach?
I'm good. How are you, Matthew?
Pretty good. Pouring with rain outside. We're experiencing spring in all its diversity. It has been getting warm, and then we had a temperature drop north of New Zealand. Got hammered by a cyclone late last week. So there's a bit of interesting weather around the place, but definitely starting to get warmer and longer days.
Yeah. Well, just a little bit ago, Acapulco, Mexico, got hit by a very unexpected and kind of a hurricane that sort of came out of nowhere, and the science is saying that that's going to be kind of the story of future cyclones is fast and fierce. That they can emerge. So, got to batten down the hatches.
Our friends in Australia are already experiencing a large number of pretty severe forest fires, which is super early in their season. Just into the early part of spring, so I haven't even hit summer there yet, and already there's some pretty significant fires, and I think even some fighters have gone over from New Zealand to help out with that already, which is pretty scary how early that is in the season.
Yeah, no kidding.
All right. Well, we've got an interview talking about Australia. A great builder they caught up with, Hamish White, over there, who's doing some really cool stuff. But before we get into that, should we do a shout out to thank some people?
Yes, absolutely. So a big thank you to our sponsors at Passive House Accelerator that make everything possible, including the Passive House podcast. So big thank you to our founding sponsors, 475 High Performance Building Supply, Baxt Ingwe Architects, Glavel, Minitaire, Mitsubishi Electric Train HVAC US, Partel, Rockwell North America, Stillcorp, and Zola Windows. Thanks too to our champion sponsors, Bewizo, Gradient, Icon Windows and Doors, Intelligent Membranes, PH Air Seal, Proseco, and Source 2050. And a big thank you to our stakeholder partner, NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority.
Very good. Did you learn this week, Zach?
I learned from Carbon Brief, which is a great, I believe, NGO that does assessments of climate policy and the implications, therefore, on carbon emissions now and moving forward. They just released a new graph based on the most recent International Energy Agency World Energy Outlook, and taking a look at what the trajectory of emissions has been for the last 5 decades, which has been a almost constant line upward in emissions during that whole time. And then the impact of policy shifts that have been going on since the Paris Accord. So pre-Paris policy, that line was expected to just keep on heading up on this continuous trajectory, getting worse and worse every year. What I'm looking at with this graph, and I'll share it in the show notes, a link to it, is that already with our current policy in 2023, the expectation is that CO2 emissions could peak in 2023. And they are expected to start to bend down. Now they're not bending down quick enough but they are starting to bend down. If we actually met the latest pledges the world has made, they would start to go down quite rapidly, which is very exciting. However, 1.5 degrees Celsius warming requires even steeper emissions reductions, so we have work to do. But the point here is that, in the words of Zeke Housefather from Carbon Brief, is that while we remain far from on track to meet our climate goals, the positive steps we've made should reinforce that progress is possible and despair is counterproductive.
Is that 1.5 target still on the table as a realistic goal?
Well, it depends on who you ask. I think it is still within science. The science still allows for the possibility.
Yeah.
And there are certain things that seem to be in line, but I think it's a stretch.
Yeah.
So I think that most people think that we're gonna go beyond it, and then hopefully we can pull back down. But yeah. I think that's really important to remember is that this is not a binary situation where we hit 1.5 degrees and then we're screwed. So who cares? Every tenth of a degree matters.
Yeah.
So if we can keep it to 1.7, that would be much better than 2 degrees.
Yeah.
For example.
Yeah. And we're also not going to know if we've hit that until we've hit it. We can only.
Yeah. And another really important point is that there are a lot of headlines out there citing the fact that the world has already hit 1.5. This at this time, or on a certain month or a certain year. And that's the difference a little bit because of El Nino. That's the difference between weather and climate a little bit, right? And that's different from like the average temperature. It's still alarming, and we shouldn't. The only reason we're even getting close to that is because of all the emissions we've spewed into the atmosphere. But it doesn't mean that we failed if we reach 1 year where we surpass 1.5 degrees Celsius.
Yeah. And do you know if there's any commentary on that about the impact of COVID and the last 2 years being a bit of an anomaly for air travel and
great question. So there's when I'm looking at the graph, it's frustrating to do this on a podcast, but I'll share it with everyone so you can see you can see that there's this plateauing that's happening, but there's a V. And that corresponds with 2020 is where the V hits. And so you can see very clearly this dip in emissions, and then it comes right back up. One of the things that highlights, though, is that simply behavior changes will only make a small difference in this problem. Right. Because we had massive behavior change in 2020 and emissions dipped to a level that was more like in line with 2013 or something, or 14, still very, very high. So we're going to have to do a lot of transformation in the way that we produce energy, use energy, and kind of societal wide changes, not simply personal behavior change.
Speaking of changes, I've been enjoying watching YouTube with my son recently. We've run out of a few Disney series.
Right.
And so we've just been sitting down and watch YouTube. And my son's getting really into cars, but he's and I'm really into electric cars and therefore batteries. And there's been quite a lot of news in the last couple of weeks about solid state batteries. So we dive in and watched a few pretty detailed videos on YouTube about solid state batteries. And a lot of that was car focused. And I'm not an advocate of just replacing all our internal combustion engine cars with electric vehicles, because that solves some of the problems, but still ends up with big sprawling cities and people in individual vehicles, and there's still quite a significant environmental impact of private vehicles. But there are lots of really good implications for the development of solid state batteries. I'm not going to go into all the technical details, but basically they are smaller, better, faster, a lot more, up to double or more the capacity, faster charging times, all the things that you'd kind of want out of a battery. the so-called solid state. And by solid state, it's similar technology. You still have an anode and a cathode and moving electrons around, but the thing that separates those to that conducts in the middle is a solid material, rather than at the moment most batteries have some sort of gel or liquid that is a conductive membrane or partition between the anode and cathode. In a solid state, it's a solid. So there are lots of benefits for that, and really the challenge now is figuring out how to ramp up production. But I dove in a little bit beyond just that background on solid state batteries, because a lot of the excitement is for vehicles. It's coming from places like Toyota, which has been a bit of a stalwart in EVs. They've been hedging their bets with hybrids and then hydrogen. But they've had a bit of a turn recently with a new CEO to put a whole bunch of R&D into battery technology, which is exciting. But I had a little bit of look as well at what the implications might be for battery technology for homes. And it does offer some pretty exciting opportunities for electrification. And there are companies out there that are starting to look at boxes similar to what people might be familiar with, the Tesla Powerwall, but there's a new player on the scene out of the US, Amtricity, people might have heard of, which are looking at solid state storage options for homes. And the benefit of that is that it vastly improves the use case for things like PV, because it means that you can actually use some of the power that your PV might generate during the day when you're maybe not at home, and then use it. Now, in the same way that I'm not a big advocate for people just switching out their internal combustion engine for an electric vehicle, I'm also not a big advocate for people just dumping a whole bunch of PV on their roof and filling their house up with batteries as a alternative to efficiency. So we always talk about building more efficient envelopes first and reducing the power that we need. But if we can get that power from a local and renewable source and store some of it in the house, then in a more environmentally friendly way, then that's got to be a good thing. So this is really exciting. It's kind of another evolution of battery technology. It's a pretty big step forward and potentially pretty exciting.
Awesome. Yeah, that is exciting. And what was the company name? We can include a link.
Amtricity. We can put some links to that, and I'll see if I can dig out. There are some really good explanation YouTube videos with people that are much smarter than me and good at explaining the technology. So we'll link up with some of those as well. Awesome. All right. Well, shall we get into this week's interview? A little bit back to the here and now. So Hamish White, I've been in touch with Hamish for a little while. Great builder in Australia, and been involved in the passive house scene over there for the last few years. But he'll sort of explain a bit of his background. His company Sanctum Homes has a very clear objective of having a positive impact on the planet, and you get a sense of that very quickly from having a quick look on their website. So it's central to all the projects that Hamish and his team work on now, is trying to provide a really great places for people to live, but also having a good impact on the world around them. So hope you enjoy this. This is my chat with Hamish White of Sanctum Homes. So I have with me Hamish White in Melbourne. I had a few people from your part of the world, but give us a quick reminder of the general climate there.
So I believe where we are, we're in climate 6, and it's, I guess, in passive house terms, it's considered reasonably mild. Mm-hmm. But correct me if I'm wrong. Where we're operating here in Warrandyte, it does get cold in winter and very hot in summer. in my mind, a perfect climate for passive house.
Yeah.
Um, but I'd probably argue that most climates are good for passive house. But
Yeah.
we have hot summers and wet winters. That's kind of been thrown out a little bit over the last few years with La Nina and El Nino and all that kind of stuff. But generally, it's a pretty good place to build. We don't lose many days from rain days, but it can get pretty hot in summer.
So take us back a bit. What's your background in the building industry? How did you get into doing what you're doing?
I originally went to university, so I got a Bachelor of Business in Marketing and Tourism, and kind of got into the building industry a little bit later than most people. But as soon as I stepped into it, it was a light bulb moment. It was exactly what I wanted to do. It was exactly where I needed to be, and I was pretty good at it. So I worked in America and in Canada for a year or two, and then came back to Australia after travelling for 4 years, and really put myself to work with getting my carpentry qualifications and then becoming a builder. Fast forward another couple of years after a failed business partnership. Started Sanctum Homes and was calling myself a sustainable builder, but with really no direction. And then I found Passive House, and it kind of provided the recipe and structure that I was looking for. I guess to really like Passive House provided the science for us to really lean in on, and I think similar to some of your past guests like Mark from MVH, we did our Passive House tradesman course at a similar time, 2017 or 18. And ever since then, we've completely pivoted our business. So all we do now is high performance and passive house.
Nice. Why did you go to university?
When I finished high school, like I went to a private school here in Melbourne, and there was just it was just the pathway that you took.
Mm.
You finish school and you go and get a uni degree. And I think the degree that I chose, which was, business marketing and tourism, was really broad. I like the idea of traveling. And don't get me wrong, I enjoyed it, but um, certainly wasn't for me. As soon as I stepped onto a building site, I just knew immediately that this is where I needed to be.
Did that feel like it wasn't an option, or was it seen as less than, or below you to do something manual instead of academia?
Do you know, I don't think it was ever talked about negatively, but it certainly wasn't put forward as a realistic option. Like it wasn't, don't become a tradesperson because, you know, it's not, it's below you. I mean, ironically, most of my friends that I'm still friends with today that I went to school with are all tradesmen. They're all running their own successful electrical, plumbing, carpentry businesses or building businesses. I certainly don't regret doing, particularly the marketing and business side of my degree, because it really has allowed me to help market my business, and I guess understanding the power of marketing and running a
Right.
business. So I don't regret doing it, but I genuinely feel that I am exactly where I need to be right now in my life with building high performance and passive house, because I love going to work every day.
And how big's your team now?
So we have offsite a pre-construction manager who helps me get our projects to site, and that's really critical for us because we do high performance and passive house. So we spend a lot of time with the design team, working through details, costs, etc. And our on-site team's 8 or 9, and we're running 4 or 5 projects at a time.
Now, you mentioned calling yourself a sustainable builder. It sounds like that wasn't really clearly defined, but Passive House kind of gave you a framework to pin that on. Is that kind of the way it works?
I guess I've always loved the outdoors, and my wife's an ecologist and now as a landscape designer. Like we're both very passionate about, I guess, protecting the environment, and we've always, I guess, as a business, tried, this is pre passive house and pre high performance homes. We're conscious about our waste. We wanted to put double glazing windows in, and we wanted to put really good insulation in. But at the time, I was like a ship without a rudder, right? We were just sort of saying we were one thing, but passive house. I liken it to like finding a religion, right? I'm not a religious person, but it kind of, it gives you direction and it gives you meaning. You've got the science to back it up. You've got the modelling in pre-construction before it goes to site, and then you then test it along the way, and people are actually validating and making sure that you're building in a certain way, and then ultimately it's going to a third party, which is then checking off everything. So I mean, sustainability is, I think it's a tricky word to sort of put a label onto, everything. And I think people do it pretty liberally. And I think sometimes it does lose its, I guess, substance. But that's probably a whole other topic of conversation. But we can confidently say that the homes that we're building are low energy, and we're really conscious about the products that we're putting into the building, from low carbon concrete to considering finishes and the paints that we use and all that kind of stuff. So I guess we are trying to be sustainable, but I just think it's good building.
Just looking at some of your recent projects on your website, which is beautiful marketing, by the way. You've got marketing experience there. Do you feel like there's a bit of an Australian vernacular that's emerging that incorporates passive house into the design of what works in that climate?
I think they partner quite well with each other. I mean, if you're looking at, we try to incorporate a lot of timber claddings into our projects, and I guess that is, quintessentially Australian. Passive solar design, I guess, has always been a pretty big thing in Australia, given our climate,
yeah,
particularly in hotter areas. So, a good passive house is also, leaning in onto, probably not so much the passive cooling side of things, but certainly orientation that sort of is wrapped up in passive solar. I do think that we have a style, and it's probably not something that I've set out to do. It's sort of something that's sort of naturally happened. I do, aesthetically, I love putting timber there. I do love having some black accents that kind of make the timber pop.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm also open to all kinds of different methodologies.
I'm interested in some of the designs that, and I see this a lot in Australia when I go visit. Quite good at creating spaces that are outdoor lounge rooms, or sort of half in, half out. Quite built up living areas that might have a full roof but no walls, so that sort of thing. That sort of halfway in between outdoor and indoor. Which I think is a sort of a maturation of the realization of the climate and how to make living spaces work well. But there's also some challenges with that, with passive house as well, because you still need to be able to seal the building up and close it when you want it to be closed. Is that a challenge?
I mean, yes and no. There's a couple of things to unpack there too, because if you're, you probably want your, outdoor areas, your alfresco areas, in your northern orientation, which is probably your best part, the best part to get your solar gains. We did have a project, one of the projects we touched on before we went on air, the Hempcrete Passive House, where we actually had the outdoor living that was backing onto a pool, and we actually needed to have operable blinds to let some of that solar gain in, particularly in winter. So the modelling would work. Is it challenging from an air tightness point of view? Not really, because we're usually building the structure first, and then we're adding on the alfrescos afterwards. So we're reducing any of that thermal bridging. We're managing for those connection points. So we're putting solid blocking in the frame, and then we're, detailing any brackets or anything that are picking up beams that are going outside. I mean, every single project has its challenges and its unique differences from one another, but yeah, it's not typically massively challenging. We've got two projects underway at the moment where we've actually left both garages off while we build the superstructure, which incorporates the thermal envelope, building off that frame once that structure's up to build the garage.
You mentioned using hempcrete. Is that the first time you've done it on the current project you're just finishing off?
We finished that one. So we finished that one last year in, I think it's almost been a year now, probably mid-September.
All right, but
yes,
it's going through certification, right?
It's going through certification at the moment, yes. Yeah, so fingers crossed that it gets across the line. I think all the data's in our favour at the moment. So, but it's not signed off until we've got that plaque. So we're incredibly excited for that one. And if I'm being honest, the clients really challenged and pushed me on that one because I was, I'm like, nah, I'm not interested in building a hempcrete house. I don't, the cost is too much. And fast forward 2 years, and we've actually just sold our home here in Warrandyte and bought another property that at some point we'll build a house on it. And I think my wife and I are pretty keen on building a hempcrete house.
Why is that?
Really hard to explain unless you've been inside one.
Mm-hmm.
But for those who have been inside a passive house before, it's very quiet and you kind of feel, I guess, a really nice, you just feel really nice inside it. The difference in going into a hempcrete house is you actually feel the mass around you.
Yeah.
And it's a really hard thing to kind of put into words. But if you go in there, it's so quiet because your walls are 300 mil thick. And, you've got the added benefit of having all that insulation, but it's also thermal mass as well. So it just feels really solid. And I absolutely love the render finish on the inside because it's so textural. So you really kind of want to run your hands over that render finish. I can't explain. And also the benefits of, using a natural material, which is incredibly fast growing. It sucks in so much carbon in that rapid growth stage because I think they're harvested within about 3 months. So huge amounts of carbon that's being captured. And then you're putting so much of that into a wall that is breathable and open vapor. And it's also allegedly, this I've been told this, it also does continue to capture some of that carbon throughout the life of the home. So I don't know, for me, it has to be a product that needs to get more into our mainstream.
Was it a structural element, or were you using that in between the timber structure?
Yeah, so there's a couple of ways to do it. So you can do the structural hempcrete blocks, or how we did it was in situ. So we had a structural frame, so to 1684 AS 1684, and around that we had some shuttering. So very typical to how you would set up a rammed earth wall, but then it's just tamped around a frame. So whereas a rammed earth wall, you're really, tapping that down super hard. With the hempcrete, you're really just lightly tapping it because you want to keep that like the volume in it, so it helps with the insulation.
Well, I look forward to seeing some more photos of that and a plaque on the wall.
Believe me, that marketing brain of mine is going to go to town when I get that plaque.
Yeah, and interesting to see where that product goes as well, because as more people get interested in both embodied carbon as well as the lower operational energy of homes, it does seem to be a very interesting product material.
Yep.
Now, you mentioned that you're pretty busy and the industry is growing, as in the high performance passive house industry in Australia. Where do you see things going in the next, say, 3 to 5 years, and where would you like to be in all that?
Well, firstly, over the last 5 years, I think it's grown exponentially. And I guess it is difficult for me to, I guess, comment on a broader spectrum because I do operate within a little bit of an echo chamber on my own social media and all that stuff. But I think with the introduction of the condensation changes and you touched on it before we went on air about air tightness being something that needs to be considered. It kind of is following that path, and it's providing an avenue for us to be including principles that we follow in Passive House. So it's not just other builders looking at what we're doing and what other builders are doing and wanting to sort of jump on board and build high performance homes. We're going to see everyone's going to have to start doing it soon, or start being more considered around the homes that they're building. And even though I don't think 7 stars is where we should be stopping our star rating, it's certainly a start. That's being introduced next year now in Victoria.
So that's 7 stars HERS, right? The home energy rating.
Yeah. So NatHERS rating, yeah. Yep.
Which is required for all new homes?
Yes. Yep. It's going to be required for all new homes. Yeah.
In context, would a passive house automatically be much higher than 7 NatHERS?
I can only speak for the homes that we've built and have modelled, but we're seeing anywhere between 8 to 8.6 stars for our passive house. And it's actually interesting, and I know you saw the presentation from Talina and Andy Marlowe, chasing a 10-star is, I don't know, there's diminishing returns over, 8.5, 9 stars. So I think the sweet spot is going to be somewhere in that 8-star range.
Well, and there was also some discussion about some perverse outcomes because it sounds like it doesn't account for infiltration all that well, but over accounts probably for thermal mass in the models based that are being used for NatHERS compliance, which means that the real life performance is maybe not as good as you might expect from a more airtight construction.
I'd love to see, if we fast forward 3 to 5 years, just more and more people getting into, I guess, this high performance space, and to kind of steal Andy and Talina's phrase, making these homes just standard and appropriate housing rather than just saying that they're high performance and they're just what comes out.
Yeah.
And where do I see, I guess, my space in it? We're going to continue to do what we do as a business. We're always looking at new products and trying to make our homes more sustainable. I'm also one of the founding directors of Builders Declare, and we're actually going through a rebranding process at the moment. We're about to be relaunched as Sustainable Builders Alliance, and that's a group of 7 of us builders, like-minded builders who are conscious about the environment. We're not all passive house builders, but we're all trying to drive change within the industry.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually run the webinars on that one, so I'll have to send you the link for the one we're doing next week.
Definitely.
Which we're looking at a product called Clinker, which is expanded clay, which can be used as sub-slab insulation. And I'm so incredibly excited to share this with a broader audience because, and apologies to the people that I bought my XPS foam from, but I'd love to see that just be completely deleted from the underside of our slabs, because it just makes that whole slab then recyclable at end of life, and it's a natural product, and it's ticking a lot of boxes.
Nice. Oh, well, look forward to seeing that, and good work with those initiatives. Hey, well, Hamish, thank you for talking to us. It's really great, and really great to see your progress, and that's I guess that steady, well, and now even more than steady, sort of exponential growth is really fantastic to see. So, all the best. We'll keep in touch.
Thanks, Matthew. Thanks for having me. Cheers.
And that was Hamish White of Sanctum Homes. You can find him at yoursanctum.com.au. He's based in Warrandyte in Victoria, just out of Melbourne. What do you think, Zach?
cool to hear somebody like he's so clear. He knows that he's where he needs to be.
Yeah.
Also, another kind of story of Passive House providing some structure and some science to make meaningful the efforts that we do in striving for quote unquote sustainable construction. So that was good to hear as well.
It's emerging as a relatively common story of a builder learning the trade, but having this desire to do something sustainable, but not really knowing what that is, or not really having a role model or a definition of that, until one day somehow stumbling across Passive House, as opposed to maybe working on some passive solar concepts prior to that, working with thermal mass and solar orientation. But then for whatever reason, coming across Passive House and starting to learn about air tightness and high levels of insulation, and then just it all making sense from there once they've got that definition.
I also realized that I have more to learn about hempcrete. It was fun to hear about hempcrete.
For all the people that I've come across that have used hempcrete, they tend to want to use it again. And I think there's a pretty compelling story around carbon with hemp as well, because a bunch of reasons. Usually it's relatively locally produced, but also just the speed in which it grows, and the fact that you're sort of locking in a source of carbon, and you don't have to transport it very far. It's very easy to process. There's a lot to be gained from that.
It sounds like there's a real kind of visceral experience of being in one of these buildings that's made from it. So
yeah. I mean, it reminds me of people in straw bale houses or rammed earth, where people just describe this feeling of walking into that place, which I think is a combination of the acoustics, but also the cleanness of the air and the stillness of it, which you just get this sort of peaceful feeling from a home like that.
Yeah. Another thing that Hamish was talking about, the exponential uptake of Passive House, at least in his bubble or echo chamber. You both were also talking about the new rules that are coming into play in Australia around condensation and airtightness as a potential driver of Passive House. Could you I know we've addressed this on the podcast before, but could you just briefly share what's going down?
I'll be able to share a lot more next week after I've caught up with Jesse Clark. So yeah, he's had a lot to do with influencing the National Construction Code in Australia. But bottom line is that there is at least a mention of the requirement to address internal moisture in the National Construction Code. Now, people like Jesse would argue that it's still very vague and doesn't go far enough, but at least it's in there as cited as a requirement that you have to take that into account. There's a big gap in education, and how do people do that without employing someone to do a full woofie model, or and there are solutions available. But it's early days, but it's a really positive move in that direction. Across the Tasman here in New Zealand, we've just, in fact, as we're recording this today, on the 3rd of November, is the first day that kicks in to the full implementation of our new insulation requirements, which interestingly has potential to have some perverse outcomes with regards to moisture, because there's been no parallel changes to the parts of our building code that deal with ventilation or internal moisture. Yeah. So that's going to be interesting, and there's a few of us that are sort of campaigning to address that. But it does mean that both the building code in New Zealand and the National Construction Code in Australia are slowly moving in the right direction. Australia, I should also mention, does cite now air tightness in one of its pathways of proving compliance. So the fact that they've got awareness of internal moisture and use the word air tightness in their construction code is a small but positive step.
Right, and when we start grappling with building science, then that's when Passive House starts to, kind of emerge as the logical endpoint.
Also, to your point about exponential growth, we're starting from a fairly low base, so it's relatively easy to double in size when you got small numbers, but it's still a really positive trend, and you do have to start from somewhere. And it's great to see that there is this emergence of interest in science, which is leading people towards passive house solutions.
Yeah, definitely. And I know I've said this before, but just to repeat that. That also means that there's a whole bunch of proof of concept that's being built all over the place in New Zealand and Australia, which will allow for policy to be enacted eventually. Like that makes advocacy around a more progressive building policy possible.
Yeah.
And then things can really take off. And I mean, it's definitely, we've seen that in North America where So I think that there is it can feel like, oh, there's so few buildings and this is frustrating and it's slow. But once those buildings are there, you can point to them and say, look, this is such a great building and it worked and it wasn't crazy expensive and it makes sense. And then when policy is enacted, that's when we see the hockey stick happen with uptick. And we're seeing it in like Massachusetts and New York and British Columbia and Vancouver and Toronto and Connecticut even. So it's definitely a real thing.
In some ways, that's the stick. The other thing that these examples do is provide the carrot, which is the inspiration of just how beautiful these homes are and how comfortable they are, so that when people visit them, then you get this market drive of a vision of passive house, which is emerging as different. Still the same when you start looking at the insulation and the fact that there's a vapor control layer and air tightness, but they have their own aesthetic, and I'm really excited about this. I've talked about this quite a lot in the past, of seeing an emergence of an Australia or a Pacific vernacular of passive house, which has some nods to European style, but is also having its own style. Things like really wide, deep eaves and outdoor living spaces where it's appropriate, and playing around with different materials on the outside and different. In some climates across Australia, it's okay to have pretty expansive windows. And people like that indoor-outdoor flow. So figuring out ways to have that quintessential Australian or Kiwi lifestyle, but still with a passive house, I think is really exciting. And that's inspiring. So I agree, it's really good to have the policy change, but it's also really good to inspire the market.
Yeah, well, and I also want to mention that you guys talked about Talina Edwards and Annie Marlowe. I'm going to include a link to the episode where you interviewed Talina and Andy, and they talked about that study that you cited, the Little Pot of Gold. So
yeah, which they highlighted. They were the keynote at the Thrive Passive House Conference earlier this year in Sydney. Yep, awesome. All right, we're going to be in Houston next week. But what else have we got coming up? So yeah, FIESCon is this week. If you're listening to the podcast when it publishes, and Matthew, we're so excited that you'll be there in Houston with us. I think we're going to get lots of stories about FIES Passive House in particular, of course, in Texas in a hot and humid environment. I know also there's going to be a whole segment of FIES work in Canada as well. And it'll be great to have Jesse Clark there as well. So we'll have some global representation there. I know there's also some stories of what's going on in Japan. I'm sure there's elsewhere. So all of us are really excited. We're going to be doing a bunch of bonus episodes at the conference. We're also going to have our regularly scheduled Passive House Accelerator live program on Wednesday at noon Eastern. You can catch that if you're not at FIESCon, but if you are at FIESCon, and I hope you are, we're really looking forward to seeing you and hanging out and taking in all the great programming they have planned for us. And will we be posting some bonus episodes out the back of that?
So we are just finishing up all the bonus episodes that we recorded in Denver at the Passive House Networks conference. And we're hoping to have that completed right before FiesCon starts. And then at FiesCon, several of us, including Matthew, will be conducting interviews at the conference of thought leaders there. And then we'll be rolling that out for a few weeks after the conference. So you'll be able to experience some of the insights and thoughts vicariously via the podcast if you're not able to be there in person.
Yeah. Well, so as always, check out the website, Passive House Accelerator, for more details, and reach out to us on the socials, and also I think we have an email somewhere as well. I think
yes, indeed. Podcast at passivehouseaccelerator.com. Oh, and I should also say that the most recent video on Reimagined Buildings features 425 Grand Concourse, which was the grand prize winner of the Fies Awards at last conference. It's a really great piece about this 227 unit affordable housing project in the Bronx, a Fies certified building, and with Carmel Pratt as the host of the episode on Reimagined Buildings on YouTube.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, Zach.
Thank you, Matthew.
We'll see you next week.